Susan Brownell Anthony, commonly known as Susan B. Anthony, was born in Adams, Massachusetts on February 15, 1820. Anthony was raised in a Quaker family. Quakers believed in religious freedom and equality. This gave her a mindset of fairness. When she was 6, she and her family moved to Bentonville, New York in 1826. During this time, Anthony was sent to a Quaker school near Philadelphia to study. Her family later moved to Rochester, New York, and became activists in the abolitionist movement, a protest to end slavery. They also started a farm due to the failure of her father's business, and it later became a meeting place for anti-slavery activists. Before becoming an activist for women's equalities, Anthony was a teacher. During her late 20s, she attended an anti-slavery convention and later became a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Around this time, in 1846, Anthony became the head of the girls' department at NHD Academy. Her yearly pay was $100, which now is worth $3,346.29. Susan B. Anthony became interested in fighting for equality and religious freedom at a young age. Her family's beliefs influenced her to become the independent woman she was. Her parents' involvement in the abolitionist movement is what gets Anthony into protesting equality. However, during this time, she wasn't as involved in the women's suffragist movement, which hadn't even existed yet. After leaving her place as the head of the NHD Academy Girls Department in 1849, she began to dedicate more of her time into social issues. In 1851, Anthony attended an anti-slavery conference. Here, Anthony meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who later helps her in the women's suffragist movement. She was later involved in the temperance movement, held by the Sons of Temperance, which was targeted to limit or completely abolish the sale and production of alcohol. This later becomes a reality during the 1920s prohibition. This influenced Anthony's passion to take a stand for women. She was denied a chance to speak at the event simply because she was a woman. The men at the temperance movement refused to let Anthony speak and told her to listen and learn. She realizes that no one would take women seriously in politics unless women got the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony had believed that the rights of women were being violated and that only white men had their full rights. This event sparked the creation of the women's suffragist movement. Just a year later, in 1852, Anthony and Stanton created the Women's New York State Temperance Society. Anthony began to start petitions for women to gain the right of owning property. She also began to travel for this cause. It wasn't until after the Civil War when Anthony started to focus more on women's rights. She and Stanton established the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, which protested equal rights for all races and sexes. In the same year, Anthony and other women's rights activists wrote a petition for universal suffrage. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens submitted the petition on January 29, 1866. 2 years later, in 1868, Anthony and Stanton created the newspaper The Revolution. The newspaper's motto was "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less." Unfortunately, this newspaper was unsuccessful, put to an end 4 years later. A year later, in 1869, the territory of Wyoming passed a Women's Suffrage Act, making them the first state to give women the right to vote. Utah followed suit shortly after, though it only lasted until 1887. Not only did she protest peacefully, she also took risks. For example, she illegally voted in an 1872 election for a representative to Congress. An account of the trial was documented. Here is a direct quote from the document. "Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny." In this quote, Susan B. Anthony stood up to the court and told them that by illegally voting as a woman, she hadn't done anything other than exercise her rights. Anthony was trying to get the people of the court to think if taking rights away is constitutional. Although she has a strong argument, Anthony was unsuccessful in convincing the court that she was innocent. She was arrested and fined $100, which is the equivalent of $1,906.98 in present time. She didn't do this on her own. 15 other women did the same thing, and they too were arrested. She never paid the fine and didn't let this stop her from continuing on in her journey for protesting women's rights. 2 years later, she sent a petition to Congress requesting that the fine be imposed upon your petitioner be remitted, as an expression of the sense of this high tribunal that her conviction was unjust. Here's what the petition looked like on the front and the back. In the early 1880s, Anthony Stanton, Ida Husted Harper, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage published the first volume of History of Women's Suffrage, with 5 more that followed. In 1896, Susan B. Anthony sent a letter to McHenry Keith discussing a new way to protest. What Susan B. Anthony told Keith was to not join a political party, but instead join all women to be their own party, since all political parties are led by men. This way, they can convince the men of the government to pass an amendment that gives women the right to vote. Even in her older years, Anthony continued to take a stand for women's rights. What effects has Susan B. Anthony made on modern-day America? A year after Anthony met with President Theodore Roosevelt and discussed an amendment to give women the right to vote, she passed away. A month before she died, Susan B. Anthony made a speech on her birthday named "Failure is Impossible." Shortly after dying, she spoke to her friend Anna Shaw and said, "To think that I have had more than 60 years of hard struggle for a little liberty and then die without it seems so cruel." Over a decade after Susan B. Anthony died on March 13, 1906, in Rochester, New York, Congress passed the 19th Amendment on June 4, 1919, and was ratified on August 18, 1920. This gave women their rights, including the right to vote. After decades of protest, Susan B. Anthony proved that failure is impossible and has remarkably affected women all over the United States. Over 40 years later, in 1979, the U.S. Treasury Department put a portrait of Susan B. Anthony on the dollar coin. Susan B. Anthony is the first woman to be so honored in the United States. During the 2016 presidential election, women put their "I voted" stickers on her grave to show gratitude for the decades of protest she went through without seeing a result. Women had visited Anthony's grave as a sign of gratitude for her hard-earned achievement. Anthony's vigorous work inspired future generations to protest for what they believe. Susan B. Anthony took a stand for hers and others' rights as women, and her actions were not in vain.